Welcome to Fictional Scientist. Here we explore dystopias, alternate realities, and the unsettling what-ifs that blur the line between fiction and possibility. If you're drawn to shadowed futures and dystopian stories, you're in the right place. Let's step into the unknown together. What if I told you that right now there's a thought in your head that wasn't there yesterday? And what if I told you that 3 months ago you had an idea that you'll never be able to think again? Dr. Marcus Webb discovered that consciousness isn't as permanent as we believed. Ideas can be installed, and they can be deleted. His invention promised to end suffering, addiction, trauma. Instead, it sparked the quietest war in human history, a war fought not with weapons, but with the systematic murder of human thought. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late to remember what we'd lost. The human brain weighs about 3 pounds. Inside that massive tissue, roughly 86 billion neurons fire in patterns so complex that no computer on Earth can fully simulate them. Each thought you have, each memory you form, each emotion you feel exists as a specific pattern of electrical activity cascading through neural pathways. These patterns are not random. They're precise, repeatable, and until March of 2029, scientists believed they were permanent. Dr. Marcus Webb proved them wrong. Marcus wasn't trying to revolutionize consciousness. He was trying to save his daughter. Emma Webb was 15 when the accident happened. A car crash on a rainy November evening that should have been minor, just a fender bender on Highway 26 outside Portland. But the way the other car's headlights had flooded through the windshield in that split second before impact, the sound of metal tearing, the smell of burnt rubber, all of it had burned itself into Emma's mind with a precision that made it impossible to forget. The physical injuries healed within weeks, but the trauma burrowed deep, manifesting as crippling anxiety that no therapy could touch. She couldn't sleep without seeing those headlights, couldn't ride in cars without feeling her chest tighten until she thought her ribs would crack. She lost 20 pounds, stopped going to school, stopped leaving her room. Marcus watched his daughter disappear into her fear, piece by piece, and something inside him broke. He had spent 20 years studying neural patterns at the Oregon Neuroscience Institute, mapping the electrical signatures of thoughts as they move through the brain. His work was academic, theoretical, the kind of research that earned grants and published papers, but changed nothing in the real world. He had written extensively about engram theory, the idea that memories exist as physical changes in neural connections. But it was all abstract until Emma's accident gave him a reason to make it real. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in March. Marcus had been running continuous electroencephalogram scans on Emma during sleep, tracking the moments when her nightmares began. He used a 256-channel EEG cap, far more sophisticated than the standard medical equipment, capable of detecting minute electrical changes across specific regions of her brain. What he noticed changed everything. The traumatic memory didn't exist as a single point in her brain. It was distributed across multiple regions. The amygdala, where fear was processed, the hippocampus, where the memory was stored, the prefrontal cortex, where she tried to rationalize it. But the pattern itself, the specific sequence of neural firing that created the panic, was consistent. It repeated every time the fear surfaced, every single time. It was like a song playing on loop. The same notes, the same rhythm, the same devastating melody. And if it was a pattern, Marcus thought as dawn broke through his lab windows, then maybe it could be interrupted. The human brain operates through electrical impulses. Neurons communicate by firing action potentials, brief bursts of electrical activity that travel along axons and trigger chemical reactions at synapses. These firing patterns create our thoughts, but electricity can be disrupted, interfered with, redirected. Marcus spent the next 6 months building something that had never existed before. The device was no larger than a smartphone, but its internal complexity rivaled a supercomputer. It used an array of 64 microcoils to generate focused electromagnetic pulses, each calibrated to target specific neural pathways without damaging surrounding tissue. The precision required was extraordinary. The human brain contains roughly 100 trillion synaptic connections. Targeting the right ones meant mapping individual firing patterns down to the millisecond. He called it neural pattern disruption, NPD. The theory was elegant. If you could identify the exact electrical signature of a traumatic memory, you could use carefully timed electromagnetic pulses to interrupt that pattern whenever it tried to fire. Do it enough times and the brain would stop reinforcing the pathway. The neurons involved would gradually prune the connections, the way the brain naturally eliminates unused neural pathways during sleep. The memory wouldn't be erased, but the emotional weight attached to it would dissolve. The first test was on a laboratory rat Marcus had acquired through his university connections. He used classical conditioning to make the animal fear a specific tone, pairing the sound with a mild electric shock until the rat would freeze in terror whenever it heard the frequency. Then he mapped the fear response, identifying the pattern of neural activity that accompanied the reaction. The rat was anesthetized. Marcus placed the NPD device against its skull and activated it. The electromagnetic pulses were invisible, silent, lasting only microseconds. He targeted the fear pathway with surgical precision. 3 sessions over 3 days, 10 minutes each. On the 4th day, Marcus played the tone again. The rat looked up, mildly curious, then went back to grooming itself. The fear was gone, not reduced, not managed, completely absent. The rat remembered the tone, its ears still perked when it heard the sound, but the association with danger had been severed at the neural level. Marcus documented everything, triple-checking the results. Then he moved to the second test, himself. He had smoked cigarettes for 20 years, ever since his residency when exhaustion and stress had made the habit feel necessary. Every attempt to quit had ended in failure. The physical addiction was manageable, but the psychological craving always clawed its way back. That moment of stress when his mind would scream for nicotine. Using the same EEG cap he'd used on Emma, Marcus mapped his own brain activity during moments of craving. He identified the pattern, a specific cascade of neural firing that originated in his nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, and spread through his prefrontal cortex. He built a customized version of the NPD device, one designed for human use. The electromagnetic pulses had to be carefully calibrated. Too weak, and they would have no effect. Too strong, and they could cause seizures or permanent damage. Marcus ran the calculations 17 times before he was confident. The first session was terrifying. He sat alone in his lab at midnight, the device wrapped around his head like a crown of thorns. When he activated it, he felt nothing. No pain, no sensation at all. Just a faint humming that might have been the machine or might have been his imagination. 20 minutes later, it was done. He lit a cigarette, more out of ritual than desire, took a drag, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no craving. It was like smoking a piece of paper. He stubbed it out and stared at his hands, waiting for the familiar anxiety of withdrawal to hit. It never came. By the 4th day, Marcus could hold a cigarette in his hand and feel nothing but mild curiosity. The addiction, the thing that had controlled him for 2 decades, had been surgically removed from his mind. That's when he realized what he had actually created. He hadn't just found a way to treat trauma or addiction. He had found a way to delete ideas from human consciousness. And if it worked on addiction, it would work on anything. Fear, love, belief, memory, morality. Any concept that existed as a neural pattern could be erased. Marcus sat in his lab as the sun rose, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuine fear, not anxiety. Fear. The kind that comes from knowing you've opened a door that can never be closed. Emma was hesitant when Marcus first explained what he'd discovered. The device looked harmless enough, a smooth black band that wrapped around the head like an elaborate set of headphones. But the idea of someone reaching into her mind, even her father, felt invasive in a way she couldn't articulate. She had spent 18 months living with the fear. It had become part of her identity. Who would she be without it? Marcus didn't push. He showed her the data from his own treatment, pulling up brain scans on his laptop, pointing to the before and after images. The regions of his brain associated with nicotine craving had physically changed. The neural pathways had thinned, weakened, almost disappeared. He explained that the memory of the crash would remain intact. She would still remember every detail, the rain, the headlights, the sound, but the fear attached to it would fade. She would remember what happened, but it wouldn't control her anymore. It would be like remembering a scary movie you watched as a child. The plot is still there, but it doesn't wake you up at night. Emma asked the question Marcus had been dreading. What if it doesn't work? What if you erase something else by mistake? Marcus had spent weeks refining the targeting protocols to avoid exactly that scenario. The electromagnetic pulses were focused down to a resolution of 5 millimeters, roughly the size of a pea. He could target the fear response without touching the surrounding memories, the good ones, the ones that made Emma who she was. But there was risk. There was always risk when you tampered with the brain. After 2 weeks of consideration, Emma agreed to try. The first session took place on a Saturday morning in March. Emma sat in Marcus's lab, the NPD device fitted carefully around her head. Marcus had spent the previous night running final calibrations, checking and rechecking the targeting coordinates. He started the session by asking Emma to recall the accident. Not the full memory, just enough to activate the fear response. She closed her eyes and thought about the headlights. Immediately her heart rates spiked. The EEG readings lit up like a Christmas tree, the familiar pattern blazing across the screen in real time. Marcus watched the pattern stabilize, then activated the device. The electromagnetic pulse was carefully timed, hitting the peak of the fear response like a needle sliding between ribs. The pattern stuttered, fragmented, tried to reassemble itself. The pulse hit again and again. Microsecond perfect timing, each pulse eroding the pathway just a little bit more. 40 minutes later, Marcus powered down the device and removed it from Emma's head. She opened her eyes slowly, like someone waking from a deep sleep. Her first words were tentative. "How am I supposed to feel?" Marcus told her to think about the crash. She did. And for the first time in 18 months, her chest didn't tighten. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed calm and even. The memory was there, clear as ever, but the weight of it had lifted. It felt distant, like remembering a movie she'd seen once, something that had happened to someone else. She looked at her father, and tears began streaming down her face. Not from fear, from relief. The second session went even better. Marcus had refined the targeting based on the first session's data, and this time the fear response was weaker to begin with. By the third session, Emma could think about the accident without any physiological reaction at all. On a sunny afternoon in April, Emma got in a car for the first time since the crash. Marcus drove, keeping his speed low, his movements smooth. Emma sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, and watched the world go by. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't feel her chest tighten. When they got home, she hugged her father and cried again. She could sleep through the night now. She could ride in cars without panic. She could smile again, something Marcus hadn't seen in over a year. He had given his daughter her life back. But late at night, alone in his lab, Marcus stared at the neural scans and felt a cold unease creeping through his chest. Because the device hadn't just weakened the fear, it had erased the neural pathway entirely. The pattern was gone, pruned away at the cellular level. The neurons that had formed that pathway had literally disconnected from each other. And if it worked on fear, it would work on anything, any idea, any belief, any thought that made a person who they were. Marcus told himself he would keep the research private. This technology was too powerful, too dangerous to release into the world. But 3 weeks later, a colleague at the university saw his notes during a lab inspection, and within a month, the secret was out. The first news article appeared in May, a small piece in a Portland newspaper about a revolutionary treatment for PTSD. Within days, it had gone viral. CNN picked it up, then the BBC, then every major outlet in the world. The media called it a miracle, a cure for trauma, addiction, phobias, depression, anxiety. The technology promised to do what decades of therapy and medication had failed to accomplish: remove suffering at its source. Marcus tried to warn them. He gave interviews, wrote op-eds, spoke at conferences. He explained that the human mind wasn't meant to have pieces surgically removed, that ideas didn't exist in isolation, that deleting one thought could have cascading effects on others. But his warnings were drowned out by the testimonials. Veterans who hadn't slept in years were suddenly free of their nightmares. A Marine who had done 3 tours in Afghanistan came to Marcus's lab, haunted by memories of an IED that killed 2 men in his unit. After treatment, he could talk about the explosion without trembling. He could sleep without seeing their faces. Addicts walked away from substances that had controlled them for decades. A woman who had been using heroin for 15 years received the treatment and felt nothing when she saw the drug again. The craving that had consumed her entire adult life simply ceased to exist. People with crippling phobias faced their fears and felt nothing. A man who hadn't flown in 20 years because of a fear of heights underwent treatment and went skydiving the following week. The FDA fast-tracked approval, citing the overwhelming evidence of efficacy and the absence of serious side effects. Within 6 months, NPD clinics opened in every major city in America, then in Europe, then across Asia. The treatment was expensive, starting at $15,000 per session, but insurance companies began to cover it. After all, it was cheaper than years of therapy and medication. At first, everything seemed perfect. The global suicide rate dropped by 18% in the first year. Emergency room visits for panic attacks fell by a third. Addiction treatment centers reported success rates that had been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Then came the side effects. They started appearing in late 2030, subtle at first. Patients who had undergone treatment for violent trauma began reporting strange emotional flatness. They couldn't feel fear anymore, not even appropriate fear. A man walked into traffic because the concept of being hit by a car no longer registered as dangerous. A woman stayed in an abusive relationship because the idea of physical harm had been stripped from her mind along with her trauma. The problem was deeper than Marcus had anticipated. Fear isn't just a single neural pathway. It's woven into dozens of cognitive processes. Remove the pathway associated with a specific trauma, and you often damaged the broader architecture of threat recognition. Marcus saw the reports and felt his stomach drop. He had warned them. Ideas don't exist in isolation. Fear isn't just a burden. It's a protection, a survival mechanism refined by millions of years of evolution. Remove it completely, and you remove the instinct that keeps people alive. But the clinics didn't stop. They adjusted. They refined their techniques, promising to target trauma more precisely while leaving protective instincts intact. They hired better technicians, invested in more sophisticated mapping technology, developed new protocols, and for a while, it seemed to work. The side effects became less common. The success stories continued to pile up. By mid-2031, over 2 million people worldwide had undergone NPD treatment. The technology was hailed as one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in human history, until the black market emerged. No one knows who cracked the encryption first. Some say it was a hacker collective operating out of Bucharest. Others claim it was an inside job, a disgruntled technician at one of the clinics who sold the blueprints to the highest bidder. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Either way, by early 2031, black market NPD devices began flooding the underground. The legitimate devices had safeguards built in. They required extensive mapping before treatment, trained operators, consent forms, psychological evaluations. The black market versions had none of that. They were crude, dangerous, and available to anyone with enough money and a willingness to look the other way. And they weren't being used to treat trauma. The first reported case appeared in Bangkok in March of 2031. A wealthy real estate developer named Somchai Ratanakosin had been embezzling money from his company for years. The guilt was eating him alive. He couldn't sleep, couldn't look his partners in the eye, couldn't enjoy the wealth he'd stolen. So he paid a street doctor $50,000 to remove the guilt. The procedure took less than an hour. When it was over, Somchai felt nothing. No remorse, no shame, no sense that what he'd done was wrong. The moral framework that had been tormenting him simply ceased to exist. He went back to work the next day and doubled down on his embezzlement. When he was finally caught 6 months later, he couldn't understand why anyone was upset. The money was there. He'd taken it. What was the problem? His lawyers tried to argue diminished capacity, that the treatment had fundamentally altered his ability to understand right and wrong. But how do you prove someone is missing an idea? The prosecution argued he was simply a sociopath who had found a convenient excuse. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years. But the damage was done. The idea was out there. You could erase inconvenient emotions, Uncomfortable thoughts, moral boundaries that got in the way of what you wanted. The second case was worse. A corporate executive in Berlin named Kristen Vogel was known for her empathy, her ability to connect with employees, to build teams, to care about the people who worked for her. But empathy was getting in the way. She couldn't make the brutal decisions that her board wanted, couldn't fire hundreds of workers without feeling their pain, couldn't prioritize profit over people. So she used a black market device to erase her empathy. The change was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks, she had restructured the entire company, laying off 40% of the workforce without hesitation. She negotiated contracts that squeezed suppliers until they went bankrupt. She manipulated competitors with strategies that bordered on criminal. Her company's stock price doubled. The board was thrilled. Kristen herself felt nothing but satisfaction at a job well done. But the people around her began to notice something wrong. She didn't laugh anymore, didn't cry, didn't seem to register other people as anything more than obstacles or assets. In meetings, she would casually suggest strategies that would destroy lives, and when someone objected, she would look genuinely confused. By the end of the year, there were thousands of cases documented worldwide. People erasing guilt, empathy, fear, love, anything that made them feel uncomfortable or held them back from what they wanted. The implications were staggering. Because the deletions were invisible, there was no way to prove what had been taken, no physical evidence, no test that could definitively show someone was missing a part of their mind. Governments scrambled to regulate the technology, but it was too late. The device was too simple, too easy to replicate. Banning it only drove it further underground, and the penalties for possession were difficult to enforce when you couldn't prove the device had been used. And then someone had an even darker idea. What if you didn't use the device on yourself? What if you used it on someone else? The first documented act of cognitive warfare happened in Columbus, Ohio, in September of 2031. A city councilman named David Chen had been leading an investigation into corruption in the municipal government. He had evidence, witnesses, documents that would bring down half the city council and implicate the mayor. He was preparing to go public. One night, someone broke into his home while he slept. They used a modified NPD device, one that had been altered to work without the extensive mapping that legitimate treatments required. It was crude, imprecise, but effective. When Chen woke up the next morning, he felt strange, disoriented, like he'd forgotten something important but couldn't remember what. He went to his office, looked at the files he'd been compiling, and felt nothing. The outrage that had driven him for months was gone. The sense that justice needed to be served had simply vanished. He dropped the investigation, told his staff he'd been mistaken, that the evidence didn't hold up, that pursuing it further would be a waste of resources. No one suspected anything. There were no physical signs of intrusion, no evidence of a crime, just a man who had suddenly changed his mind. It happened again 2 weeks later in Seattle. An environmental activist who had been organizing protests against a pipeline project suddenly lost interest. She couldn't explain why. One day she was passionate, angry, determined. The next, she couldn't remember what she'd been fighting for. The pattern began to emerge. Journalists who suddenly stopped pursuing stories. Whistleblowers who forgot why they'd been afraid. Union organizers who lost their commitment to workers' rights. By mid-2032, intelligence agencies around the world had figured out what was happening and had begun weaponizing the technology themselves. The CIA developed a tactical version, small enough to fit in a briefcase, powerful enough to erase specific ideas from anyone within a 5-meter radius. They used it on foreign operatives, political dissidents, anyone who posed a threat to American interests. The FSB in Russia went further. They developed broadcast devices that could target entire crowds, erasing collective ideas like resistance or protest. In Moscow, a demonstration of 50,000 people calling for democratic reforms was dispersed not with tear gas or batons, but with an invisible pulse that erased the very concept they'd been fighting for. China's Ministry of State Security created the most sophisticated system, integrating NPD technology into their existing surveillance infrastructure. Dissidents weren't arrested anymore, they were treated. The idea of freedom, the concept of individual rights, was surgically removed from their minds. They went back to their lives as model citizens, and they never understood what had been taken. The technology had become the perfect authoritarian tool, quieter than assassination, cleaner than imprisonment, and completely untraceable. Marcus watched the world spiral and felt the weight of his creation crushing him. He had wanted to help his daughter. Instead, he had given humanity a weapon more insidious than anything that had come before. A way to murder, thought itself. He tried to speak out. Gave desperate interviews where he begged governments to destroy the technology, wrote manifestos explaining the danger, but his credibility was gone. He was written off as a paranoid scientist who couldn't handle the consequences of his own invention. So in the fall of 2032, Marcus went underground. In the shadows, a movement began to form. People who had noticed the changes. Therapists who saw patients lose their convictions overnight. Neuroscientists who understood the implications. Hackers who tracked the spread of black market devices through dark web forums. They called themselves the Conservators. Their mission was simple but nearly impossible. Document what was being lost, because the cruelest part of cognitive warfare wasn't just that ideas were being erased, it was that no one could remember they had ever existed. How do you fight an enemy that erases the memory of the battle itself? Marcus joined them in late 2032, brought in by a former colleague who had been tracking his movements. The Conservators operated out of safe houses scattered across the globe, moving locations every few weeks to avoid detection. Their headquarters, if it could be called that, was a converted warehouse in Detroit. Inside, rows of servers hummed day and night, storing encrypted copies of neural scans from volunteers. They were building an archive of human thought, a backup of consciousness that could survive the deletions. The leader of the Conservators was a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese neuroscientist who had worked on brain-computer interfaces before the NPD technology emerged. She had seen the danger immediately and had spent the last year recruiting others who understood what was at stake. Yuki explained something to Marcus that he hadn't fully grasped in his own research. You can't restore a deleted idea. Once a neural pathway is erased, it's gone. The neurons involved disconnect from each other. The synaptic connections are pruned away. The brain can form new pathways, learn new ideas, but the original thought pattern is lost forever. It's not like deleting a file on a computer where you can recover it from the recycle bin. It's like burning a book that exists in only one copy. Once it's gone, it's gone. Some ideas, once killed, stay dead forever. The Conservators showed Marcus their research. They had been tracking cognitive shifts across populations, mapping which ideas were disappearing and where. The data was chilling. In authoritarian countries, the concept of freedom was being systematically erased from political prisoners. Brain scans of dissidents before and after re-education showed massive changes in the neural networks associated with autonomy and self-determination. In corporate environments, the idea of worker rights was vanishing from union leaders. Companies were quietly using the technology to make their workforce more compliant, more accepting of exploitation. In conflict zones, the notion of peace was being deleted from negotiators. Warlords who wanted the fighting to continue would target anyone trying to broker ceasefires, erasing their ability to even conceive of reconciliation. The war wasn't being fought with bullets or bombs. It was being fought with silence, with the systematic murder of human thought. And the silence was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Marcus spent his first month with the Conservators helping them refine their scanning techniques. They needed to be able to create detailed neural maps quickly before ideas could be erased. He designed portable scanners that could be hidden in everyday objects, watches, glasses, jewelry. Volunteers would wear them, creating continuous backups of their thought patterns. But even as they worked, Marcus could see they were losing the war. For every person they scanned, 1,000 were being altered. For every idea they preserved, 100 were being deleted. The scale was overwhelming. And then Yuki shared the worst part. They had discovered that the deletions were accelerating, not just in frequency, but in scope. Someone, somewhere, had figured out how to erase ideas from multiple people simultaneously. Mass deletions, targeting entire populations at once. The evidence was in the data. Entire cities where specific concepts had vanished overnight. a neighborhood in São Paulo where no one could remember what democracy meant, a district in Mumbai where the idea of religious tolerance had been wiped clean. The technology was evolving, and humanity was running out of time. By 2033, the changes were impossible to ignore. People stopped protesting, not because they were afraid, but because the idea of resistance no longer occurred to them. Activists woke up one day and couldn't remember why they had been angry. The passion that had driven them, that had given their lives meaning, was just gone. Marcus witnessed it firsthand in Chicago. The conservators had sent him to document a climate protest, one of the largest in the city's history. 50,000 people were expected, marching from Grant Park to City Hall, demanding action on emissions. He arrived early, scanning the crowd with hidden neural monitors, capturing baseline readings of the protesters' thought patterns. The data was beautiful in its intensity. Complex webs of belief about environmental justice, interconnected ideas about responsibility, future generations, the sacredness of the natural world. The march began at noon. By 12:15, something changed. Marcus noticed it in the crowd's energy first. The chants became less coordinated. People started looking confused, checking their phones, talking to each other with uncertain expressions. By 12:30, the march had slowed to a crawl. People were wandering off, drifting away in small groups. Not angry, not scared, just disinterested. Marcus checked his neural monitors and felt his blood run cold. The belief patterns he'd captured an hour earlier were fragmenting, dissolving in real time. Someone had activated a broadcast device, and it was erasing the very ideas that had brought these people together. By 1 o'clock, the protest had dissolved entirely. 50,000 people had simply dispersed, wandering back to their cars and their lives, unable to remember why they'd come. The local news reported it as a failed demonstration, poor turnout due to bad weather. But Marcus knew the truth. The protest hadn't failed. It had been murdered. Elections became hollow rituals. Voters couldn't articulate what they wanted because the concepts they needed to describe their needs had been quietly removed. In the 2032 midterms, turnout was the lowest in American history, not because people were apathetic, but because the idea of political change no longer existed for millions of voters. Democracy didn't collapse in a dramatic coup. It just faded like a photograph left in the sun until it was barely recognizable. The conservators tried to sound the alarm, but they faced an impossible problem. How do you convince someone they're missing an idea when they can't remember having it in the first place? It was like trying to describe color to someone who had been blind since birth. You could explain it, demonstrate it, provide all the evidence in the world, but if they couldn't perceive it themselves, they would never truly understand. Worse, the technology was evolving in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. The early devices required close proximity, direct contact with the skull for maximum effectiveness. But by late 2033, researchers had developed methods to broadcast the disruptive signal over greater distances. A modified device could erase an idea from everyone within a 100-meter radius. The targeting was less precise, the effects varied between individuals, but the scale was unprecedented. The first large-scale public deployment happened in March of 2034. A protest had been organized in Seattle, 5,000 people gathering to demand corporate accountability after a major financial scandal. The companies involved had bilked investors out of billions, and the evidence was overwhelming. The protest was peaceful, organized, growing momentum by the hour. Then someone activated a broadcast device from a nearby office building. Marcus was there, monitoring from a safe distance. He watched through binoculars as the crowd's behavior changed. It wasn't dramatic. No one collapsed or screamed. They just stopped. The chants faded, the signs lowered. People looked at each other with confused expressions, like they'd forgotten why they were there. Within 20 minutes, the crowd had dispersed entirely. 5,000 people wandering away in different directions, confused but not alarmed. The next day, when reporters interviewed participants, no one could explain what had happened. They remembered going to the protest, but they couldn't remember what they'd been protesting about. The corporation that had been the target issued a statement expressing confusion about the demonstration. The media moved on to other stories. and the financial scandal quietly disappeared from public consciousness. No tear gas, no arrests, no violence, just silence. By mid-2034, governments worldwide finally began taking the threat seriously, but their responses varied wildly and often made things worse. The European Union passed the Cognitive Protection Act, banning unauthorized neural modification and imposing harsh penalties for possession or use of NPD devices. Penalties ranged from 10 years in prison to life sentences for cases involving mass deletions. But enforcement was nearly impossible. The devices left no physical trace. There was no way to prove someone's mind had been altered unless you had a detailed neural scan from before the deletion, and almost no one did. The United States took a different approach. The Department of Homeland Security classified NPD technology as a national security issue and began developing countermeasures. They funded research into neural shielding, attempting to create barriers that would block electromagnetic pulses from reaching the brain. Early prototypes looked like bicycle helmets lined with copper mesh, bulky and obvious. Wearing one marked you as either paranoid or informed, depending on your perspective. China, Russia, and several other authoritarian states did something far more sinister. They embraced the technology. Government-run programs began offering voluntary cognitive optimization to citizens. The programs claimed to remove dangerous ideologies, extremist thinking, antisocial tendencies. In practice, they erased dissent. People who showed signs of questioning government authority, who read banned books, who attended underground religious services, were offered treatment. Refusing treatment often led to social isolation, job loss, or arrest on fabricated charges. Within 2 years, these programs had processed millions of people. Marcus obtained leaked documents from a facility in Xinjiang. The reports were clinical, detached, describing the erasure of religious belief as if it were a medical procedure. Success rates were over 90%. Side effects were deemed acceptable. The documents included before and after neural scans, showing the systematic destruction of the cognitive frameworks that made someone capable of faith. A few nations tried to protect their populations with mandatory cognitive monitoring. Singapore implemented a program requiring annual brain scans for all citizens, creating a baseline that could detect unauthorized modifications. But the program was expensive, invasive, and faced fierce opposition from civil liberties groups who called it thought surveillance. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. People were more afraid of having their thoughts monitored than they were of having their thoughts erased. By 2035, the world had fractured into 3 distinct groups. The first group consisted of people who had altered, knowingly or not. They moved through life with gaps in their thinking, missing pieces they couldn't identify. They functioned, worked, lived, raised families, but something essential had been taken. They were like computers running without certain programs, capable but incomplete. The second group was those who knew what was happening and were desperately trying to protect themselves. They avoided crowds where broadcast devices might be deployed. They wore experimental shielding devices despite the social stigma. They kept detailed journals of their beliefs and convictions, writing down their thoughts every day so they could recognize if something disappeared. The third group was the ones doing the erasing, governments seeking control, corporations seeking profit, criminals seeking advantage, extremists seeking to reshape society according to their vision. Anyone who realized that the easiest way to win an argument was to delete the opposing viewpoint entirely. And caught in the middle were people like Marcus and the conservators, who understood that they had opened a door that could never be closed, watching helplessly as humanity tore itself apart, one thought at a time. Where there's a void, a market emerges. And by 2035, a strange new economy had appeared in the shadows of the dark web. People were selling memories, ideas, recorded neural patterns that could be implanted into others. The technology for implantation had existed for years, developed originally for patients with severe brain injuries, but now it was being repurposed. If your concept of love had been erased, you could buy it back. If your understanding of justice had been deleted, you could purchase a copy from someone else. The marketplace operated through encrypted networks, vendors offering neural patterns categorized by type and intensity. Want to feel what passionate love feels like? Download this pattern from a newlywed. Need to understand artistic beauty? Here's a neural map from a painter. Looking for religious faith? Multiple denominations available. Prices varied wildly. Common ideas, basic emotions were cheap. Complex philosophical frameworks, specialized knowledge, unique perspectives commanded premium prices. A complete neural map of a chess grandmaster's strategic thinking sold for six figures. But there was a fundamental problem that the vendors never quite acknowledged. Ideas aren't universal. Your understanding of love wasn't the same as mine. Your sense of justice was shaped by your experiences, your culture, your personal history. Implanting someone else's neural pattern meant adopting someone else's perspective, someone else's feelings, someone else's truth. Marcus interviewed dozens of people who had purchased implanted ideas. Their descriptions were eerily consistent. The thoughts felt foreign, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. They could access the ideas, use them, think through them, but there was always a sense of disconnect. One man described it as being a tourist in his own mind. He had purchased a pattern for professional ambition after his own drive had been erased during a corporate restructuring. The pattern worked, in a sense. He could think strategically about his career and plan for advancement, work toward goals, but it felt hollow, like he was following a script written by someone else. Some people became addicted to the process. They would erase and reimplant ideas over and over, trying on different versions of themselves like masks. A woman Marcus spoke with had been through 17 different personality configurations in 2 years. On Monday, she might believe in God. On Tuesday, she was an atheist. Wednesday, she subscribed to Eastern philosophy. Each time, she was convinced it was authentic, that this version of herself was the real one. But the people around her could see the truth. She had become a stranger to herself, fragmented and lost. The memory market also created a darker opportunity. Criminal organizations began harvesting neural patterns from unwilling victims. A kidnapping victim might have their skills, their knowledge, their expertise copied and sold. A researcher might wake up to find their breakthrough discoveries had been stolen not from their lab, but from their mind. Identity became fluid, disposable, something you could change as easily as a haircut. Marcus watched this new world with horror. Humanity wasn't just losing ideas, it was losing the concept of a stable self, the notion that your thoughts were your own, that your identity was something coherent and continuous. The conservators tried to preserve what they called original human thought. They scanned volunteers and stored their neural patterns in secure databases, hoping that one day, if the deletions stopped, they could help people remember what had been lost. They built a massive archive in an abandoned salt mine in Poland. The facility was temperature-controlled, heavily encrypted, protected by multiple layers of security. Inside, thousands of neural scans were stored on quantum drives, backed up across redundant systems. It was meant to be humanity's cognitive library of Alexandria, a repository of thought that could survive whatever was coming. In March of 2036, hackers breached the facility. No one knew who they were or who had hired them, but in less than an hour, they wiped the entire archive. Thousands of unique thought patterns, irreplaceable records of human consciousness, gone forever. The backup systems had been compromised weeks earlier. There was nothing to recover. The conservators rebuilt, but the message was clear. Nothing was safe, not even memories of memories. By 2037, the world had learned to live with cognitive warfare the way previous generations had learned to live with nuclear weapons. It was a constant threat, a shadow that hung over every interaction, but life went on. People learned to recognize the signs of deletion, though recognition didn't mean you could stop it. A friend who suddenly stopped caring about something they had been passionate about their whole life. A colleague who couldn't remember why they had been holding a grudge. A family member who seemed emotionally flat, going through the motions of relationships without the underlying feelings. The conservators had identified what they called cognitive tells, subtle behavioral markers that suggested someone had been altered. A person who had lost their capacity for guilt would make different ethical decisions. Someone whose empathy had been erased would struggle with emotional reciprocity. A mind missing its fear response would take irrational risks. But recognizing the signs didn't mean you could help. There was no treatment, no way to restore what had been taken. You could only document the loss and hope that someday, somehow, a solution would emerge. Marcus had become a ghost by this point. He moved from city to city, never staying anywhere longer than a few weeks. He helped the conservators document the disappearance of human thought, interviewing victims, collecting neural scans, tracking the spread of the epidemic. He met people who had lost everything that made them who they were. An artist in Prague who could no longer create. The spark of inspiration that had driven her for 30 years had been erased. She could still paint technically. Her hands remembered the movements, but there was no vision behind it. She produced works that were competent, but soulless. A philosopher in Mumbai who couldn't think critically anymore. His ability to question, to doubt, to analyze had been deleted. He could still teach, reciting the arguments of others, but he couldn't engage with them. His mind had become an echo chamber, reflecting ideas without examining them. A woman in Toronto who had lost the capacity to love. She stayed with her husband and children out of habit and duty, but she felt nothing when she looked at them. The neural pathways that created attachment, that generated the warmth and connection of family bonds, were gone. She went through the motions of motherhood and marriage, but inside she was hollow. The cruelest cases were the children. A generation was growing up in a world where ideas were treated as optional. Schools began offering cognitive optimization programs where students could have distracting thoughts removed to improve focus. Parents consented, thinking they were helping their kids succeed. A child with ADHD could have their scattered attention patterns cleaned up. A student with anxiety could have their fear of failure erased. A teenager struggling with their identity could have their confusion smoothed away. But those children grew into adults who couldn't question authority because their capacity for skepticism had been removed, who couldn't dream beyond what they were told to want because imagination had been deemed inefficient, who couldn't conceive of a world different from the one they were given because the very idea of alternative possibilities had been erased. Marcus met a girl who reminded him heartbreakingly of Emma. She was bright, polite, well-adjusted, but when he asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she looked at him with empty eyes. The concept of aspiration had been removed. She existed, but she didn't dream. She would follow the path laid out for her, work the job assigned to her, live the life designed for her, and she would never wonder if there could be more. That night, Marcus made a decision that would either save humanity or destroy what was left of it. If ideas could be killed, Marcus thought, then maybe the solution was to create an idea that couldn't die. He spent the next 2 years working on it in secret, even from most of the conservators. The concept was theoretically simple, but practically overwhelming. He called it the anchor. The anchor wasn't a single thought or belief. It was a metacognitive framework, a way of thinking about thinking itself. It was built on the fundamental human drive to ask why, the recursive curiosity that sits at the root of consciousness. Marcus's theory was that if you could strengthen this core curiosity, weave it so deeply into someone's neural architecture that it became inseparable from their sense of self, then any attempt to erase an idea would trigger that curiosity. The person would notice something was missing. They would ask questions. They would resist. The challenge was implementation. Installing the anchor required complete neural mapping and precise modifications across dozens of brain regions. It wasn't a simple deletion, but a complex reconstruction, strengthening existing pathways and creating new ones that reinforced each other in recursive loops. The procedure took 6 hours and required the patient to be conscious for most of it. Marcus had to guide them through exercises that activated different cognitive patterns while he adjusted the electromagnetic pulses in real time. One wrong calibration could cause seizures, strokes, or permanent cognitive damage. The failure rate was 40%, but those who survived reported something remarkable. They could feel it when someone tried to erase an idea. Like a pressure building in their minds, a wrongness they couldn't ignore. The anchor made them aware of the attack, and awareness was enough to resist it. Their brains would automatically compensate, routing around the disruption, preserving the thought through sheer recursive questioning. Why am I feeling this pressure? What's being taken? Who's trying to take it? The questions themselves became the protection. News of the anchor spread through underground networks. People began seeking out the conservators, desperate for the treatment, but demand far exceeded supply. Marcus was one of only 3 people who could perform the procedure safely, and even working around the clock, they could only treat a few dozen people per week. By late 2038, approximately 2,000 people worldwide had received the anchor. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was a start. Then, governments began to notice. Intelligence agencies realized that people with the anchor couldn't be controlled through cognitive warfare. They were immune to the very technology that had become essential for modern statecraft. In January of 2039, a coalition of governments, including the United States, China, Russia, and the European Union, issued a joint declaration. The anchor was classified as a cognitive weapon. Possession of the neural pattern was illegal. Anyone found with it would be prosecuted under international law. The conservators were labeled a terrorist organization. Their members were hunted, their safe houses raided, their equipment seized. Marcus went into the deepest hiding of his life, moving through a network of sympathizers who risked everything to protect him. But his reputation preceded him. He was the man who had created the technology that broke human consciousness. And now he was the man trying to create the shield. He became the most wanted person on Earth. The final confrontation came on a cold morning in February of 2040. Marcus had been working in a small laboratory hidden beneath a farmhouse in Iceland. The location had been chosen carefully, remote enough to avoid casual detection, but connected enough to maintain contact with the conservators' network. He was close. So close. He had refined the anchor to the point where it could be transmitted directly from person to person through sustained close contact. Not as reliable as the full procedure, but effective enough. If he could release it into a population, the idea would protect itself, spreading through human connection like a benevolent virus. He called it cognitive immunity. But before he could complete the work, they found him. It wasn't a dramatic raid, no helicopters or armed soldiers. Just 3 people in dark suits who walked in through the front door early one morning. They had been tracking him for months, following the digital breadcrumbs he'd left despite his best efforts to hide. They didn't kill him. Killing him would have made him a martyr, and martyrs inspire movements. Instead, they did something far more effective. They used his own device on him. The procedure took 4 hours. Marcus was strapped to a chair in his own laboratory. His own equipment turned against him. They didn't need to be gentle or precise. They weren't trying to help him. They were trying to erase him. First, they deleted his memory of the anchor. The entire framework, every insight, every refinement, gone. The neural pathways he had spent 2 years building dissolved under the electromagnetic pulses. Then they went deeper. They erased his understanding of neural patterns, the knowledge that had made him one of the world's foremost neuroscientists. The insights about engrams and consciousness that had led to his breakthrough, wiped clean. They deleted his memory of the conservators, of the resistance, of the fight he had been waging. They took his guilt about what his invention had become, the horror he felt watching the world tear itself apart, the driving need to fix what he had broken. When they were done, Dr. Marcus Webb no longer remembered why he had been fighting. He couldn't remember the technology he had created or the war it had started. He couldn't remember the years spent trying to undo the damage. He remembered Emma. He remembered her accident and wanting to help her. He remembered the early days of his research, the hope that he could ease suffering, but everything after that was gone. They released him the next day. Dropped him off at a psychiatric facility in Reykjavik with a fabricated medical history of early onset dementia. The doctors accepted him without question. Just another patient with a deteriorating mind. The conservators tried to rescue him, but by the time they learned where he was, it was too late. The deletions had been too extensive. There was no way to restore what had been taken. Marcus Webb spent his remaining years in that facility, staring out windows at a world he no longer understood. Sometimes he would sketch neural patterns on napkins, his hands remembering movements his mind couldn't explain. The nurses thought it was sweet, an old scientist clinging to fragments of his former life. They had no idea they were looking at the ghost of the man who had changed what it meant to be human. By 2042, the war had ended. Not because one side won, but because there was nothing left to fight for. The ideas that had once driven humanity, freedom, justice, love, curiosity, the complex web of beliefs and values that made civilization possible, had been erased and reinstalled so many times that they no longer meant anything. They were copies of copies, degraded and distorted, like a photograph that had been scanned and reprinted until only a blur remained. People went through the motions of living, but the spark was gone. Elections were held, but voters couldn't articulate what they wanted. They chose candidates based on vague feelings, unable to connect their choices to any coherent worldview. Protests still happened occasionally, but they lacked conviction. People would gather, chant slogans, and then disperse, unable to sustain the passion necessary for real change. Art became derivative. Without the cognitive frameworks that enabled genuine creativity, artists could only recombine existing ideas in superficial ways. Science stagnated. Breakthrough discoveries require the ability to question assumptions, to imagine alternatives, to think beyond current paradigms. When those capacities were erased, progress stopped. The conservators had scattered. Some were dead. Some had given up. A few still operated in secret, protecting the last remaining archives of unaltered human thought, but they were fighting a war they had already lost. Emma Webb, now in her late 30s, sometimes thought about her father. She would visit him at the facility in Iceland, sitting beside his bed while he stared at nothing. She didn't know the full truth of what had happened. The official story was that he had developed dementia. A tragedy, people said. Such a brilliant mind lost. But sometimes when she held his hand, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. A moment of recognition, a flash of the father she had known. Then it would fade, and he would go back to staring at his sketches, trapped in a mind that had been systematically dismantled by the very technology he had created to help her. The world moved on. People adapted to the new normal the way humans always do. They worked, they ate, they slept, they formed relationships and raised children and built lives that looked, from the outside, like the lives that had come before. But something essential was missing. When you asked people what they believed in, what they wanted, what they dreamed about, they struggled to answer. Not because they didn't want to tell you, but because the ideas they needed to form those answers were no longer there. They had been taken, piece by piece, thought by thought, until all that remained was a species that looked human, but had forgotten what it meant to be. And the cruelest part? They didn't even know what they were missing. So, I'll ask you again. What if I told you that right now there's a thought in your head that wasn't there yesterday? Would you believe me? What if I told you that 3 months ago, you had an idea that you'll never be able to think again? Could you prove me wrong? Or have you already forgotten how to ask that question? In a world where ideas can be killed, the most dangerous thing isn't what you've lost. It's not knowing you've lost anything at all.